Breaking news has just arrived from Buckingham Palace as an official statement is issued detailing an extraordinary transition order. Shortly after sunrise, an emergency royal decree sealed inside a crimson folder was presented to King Charles. Only 3 people had ever been permitted to see its contents. He carefully read the closing paragraph twice, reached for his fountain pen, and signed the document without inviting Prince William into the room. With that single signature, the monarch reshaped the terms of his son's upcoming reign, leaving senior palace insiders questioning whether this action served as a protective measure, a sharp reprimand, or a desperate warning from a father running out of time. Before exploring what this development means for the royal institution, consider subscribing to stay informed on future updates. Charles remained seated long after the ink dried, staring intently at the empty chair across the room where William should have received news of his succession directly. Instead, the heir would learn the truth through an official briefing stripped of all warmth, discussion, or trust. The emergency decree created a mandatory Regency Council tasked with overseeing William's first 12 months on the throne. While it would not strip him of his royal title, the measure limited his authority to make major household, financial, or constitutional decisions independently during his initial year as king. The monarch designed the body alongside Princess and 3 senior constitutional experts who advised the crown on state affairs. Their work had been conducted in secrecy for months, proving this was no sudden impulse, but a calculated response to hidden palace concerns. William opened the sealed folder in total silence. His expression tightened with hurt rather than immediate anger as he searched the text for any sign that his father still trusted his judgment. None was given. He then reached a handwritten clause granting the council authority to delay any key appointments if members believed the new king was operating under personal strain. The language was broad enough to halt major decisions before they took effect. And put down her glasses after reading the final page and posed a direct question. Did the prince realize the decree would take effect the exact moment Charles was no longer able to fulfill his duties? Her tone was pragmatic, but the underlying message was clear. This document was not designed for a distant scenario, but for the immediate future. William turned to the confidential appendix, expecting a list of government officials, only to find Catherine named in a role with direct influence over family affairs. He stopped reading, as his father's silence transformed his initial hurt into deep suspicion. The decree did far more than create a divide between the king and his successor. It forced everyone in William's inner circle to demonstrate where their true loyalties lay. To the public, Charles and William represented seamless continuity, but behind closed doors, they harbored vastly different visions for the crown. Charles feared his son would move too quickly with radical reforms, while William worried his father would never fully hand over control. Catherine, caught between her devotion to her husband and her loyalty to the monarch, was suddenly placed at the center of an order capable of altering all 3 of their lives. William reviewed the confidential appendix in their private quarters, fixated on Catherine's name. The document outlined specific powers not detailed in the main decree. When he read her name aloud and asked if she had prior knowledge of the arrangement, her brief pause felt like confirmation of his worst fears. Though she firmly denied knowing anything beforehand, tension had already settled between them. Catherine reviewed the section herself, discovering that during the supervised transition period, she would hold an advisory vote covering family welfare, household stability, and matters involving the younger generation. The role granted her formal influence during a year marked by grief and high pressure. A handwritten note described her as the stabilizing presence of the royal household, proving Charles trusted her judgment alongside his son's power. Charles experienced his own distress while sitting with and maintaining that controlling William was never his intent. The king believed the monarchy survived through tradition, hierarchy, and steady evolution, whereas his heir advocated for a leaner, faster, and more modern institution. The contrast between their approaches had grown dangerous, as choices made early in a reign could impact the crown for decades. The king admitted that a single hasty decision could cause irreversible damage, and observed him closely, recognizing the decree as a father's attempt to safeguard his son during a vulnerable transition, though she warned that protection without trust feels identical to punishment. Queen Camilla discovered her complete omission from the document shortly after. She searched the text for a designated seat on the council, but found none. Although she held status as queen consort, the council would govern the early stages of William's reign without granting her a vote. She quietly closed the file, recognizing that her influence was being systematically reduced before any formal announcements were made. Catherine pondered the note attached to her name, while William reflected on the public event that triggered the fallout, a rejected command, and the sharp look on his father's face that no one present had forgotten. Months prior to the emergency decree, a carefully planned investiture at Windsor Castle collapsed into open discord. William had been tasked with announcing the continuation of several traditional royal appointments. Instead, he stepped up to the podium, closed his folder, and declared that the monarchy could no longer ask for public trust while maintaining outdated privileges. Charles watched in silence, his expression signaling to and that a fundamental break had occurred between them. William had voiced objections to the plan before the event took place. The investiture was designed to signal stability to senior court officials, but the prince felt several ceremonial roles were overly costly and out of touch with the public, arguing their funding should be redirected toward charitable causes. Charles acknowledged the argument, but ordered his son to refrain from changes until a complete review was finished. Closing the folder changed everything. By announcing an immediate review of every disputed post, William directly contradicted the king's instructions before the entire room. Senior aides looked away as Anne watched her brother stand motionless, aware that intervening publicly would only worsen the spectacle. Charles retrieved the abandoned speech after the crowd dispersed, carefully folding each page along its seams, as if restoring order to the paper could undo the damage. A furious outburst would have been easier for William to process. The quiet reaction signaled deep betrayal in front of the very officials the ceremony was meant to reassure, and accompanied the king down a private hall, where a courtier later documented Charles remarking that while William was ready to inherit the crown, he was not yet ready to be constrained by it. The statement reflected a growing concern that passion without restraint could prove dangerous once no higher authority remained to check it. That evening, Charles requested historical records regarding emergency accession protocols, ancient legal mechanisms created to guide a new ruler through uncertain transitions. That request set in motion the drafting of the decree now dividing the family. Upon reading his briefing, William immediately demanded an unscheduled face-to-face meeting with his father, insisting on no aides, no advisors, and no buffers. The upcoming conversation would feature no formal speeches or onlookers, just a monarch explaining his actions to an heir questioning whether he retained his father's trust. William entered the king's private study with the folded decree tucked under his arm. Charles stood by the hearth, waiting alone without secretaries or legal advisors. After a tense silence, William set the document on the desk and pushed it forward, stating calmly that his father had not prepared him to rule, but had instead created a committee to restrict him the moment he took the throne. Charles made no move toward the papers, having ordered the doors locked to keep everyone out. The confrontation had moved beyond legal technicalities into a direct test of trust between a father and his successor. William accused the king of humiliating him before the very institution he was set to inherit. While the council could not block his accession, it placed temporary limits on major decisions during a year when grief and sudden responsibility might lead to errors. To the prince, the setup felt like a public declaration that he could only be trusted under supervision. Charles countered that public popularity was not the same as patience, and that high approval ratings could not protect the institution from poorly considered choices. His words targeted William's core confidence, challenging the prince's belief that his connection with the public guaranteed he understood the future of the crown. William then produced a second document from beneath the decree, an earlier draft sent to him privately, that set the council's duration at 3 years rather than 12 months. The king's expression shifted, as that initial draft was never meant to leave the secure archive. Its release meant someone within the palace wanted the prince to see the most severe form of his father's doubts. Charles explained that the timeline had been shortened after Catherine privately defended her husband, arguing that immense pressure strengthened his resolve rather than weakening it. Though she was unaware of the document's true purpose, her intervention succeeded in reducing the restriction by 2 years. As William turned to leave, Charles delivered a final warning that stopped him in his tracks. Key figures within the royal household were actively attempting to manipulate the future reign before it even began. William had entered the room viewing his father as the primary obstacle to his independence, but left realizing Charles was acting out of fear of outside influences. The decree bore the king's signature, but the underlying concern was driven by confidential records William had never seen. Inside a locked vault lay private files detailing attempts to influence his future court, staff appointments, and finances prior to his accession, and opened the cabinet herself and handed the files to William. Instead of political briefings, he found records of internal lobbying, family maneuvers, and an organized effort to control access to the future monarch, and instructed him to read every name listed. She noted that real influence within the palace relies not just on titles, but on who manages the calendar, handles correspondence, selects key advisors, and determines who gains private access to the sovereign. William turned the pages slowly as his frustration turned to shock upon seeing familiar names attached to requests he had never approved. Some came from long-trusted aides, while others originated from departments already organizing his future court as if his input was unnecessary, and observed his reaction as anger gave way to deep concern. William now recognized the underlying threat. Taking the throne amidst personal grief could leave him exposed to aggressive demands before he could establish his own administration. Charles had anticipated this exact vulnerability, knowing a new monarch could be pressured into lasting commitments while emotionally drained. The personal pressure clause had been added after the king intercepted a draft briefing presenting several major appointments as settled facts, despite William never agreeing to them. Camilla sat alone as details of the council's composition reached her quarters. Reading through the list, she confirmed her complete exclusion from the governing body. Camilla sat alone as details of the council's composition reached her quarters. Reading through the list, she confirmed her complete exclusion from the governing body. Charles had structured the safeguard without giving her a seat, signaling that the future royal household would no longer be directed by her private network, and pointed out the most concerning entries in the file, which documented repeated attempts from Camilla's office to lock in senior positions ahead of the transition. While the records did not prove her direct involvement in every instance, they revealed a coordinated effort operating near her circle that alarmed the king. William closed the final folder with a clear understanding of why his father had taken such extreme measures, though the discovery offered little comfort. It proved the core threat originated from within the family structure, making a confrontation with Camilla unavoidable. The emergency decree no longer appeared as a slight against William, but as a protective boundary placed between his future administration and those seeking to influence it prematurely. By afternoon, the palace was filled with hushed conversations and sudden silence whenever the prince walked through the halls. Though the decree remained secret from the public, its operational impact was immediate. Scheduled meetings were canceled, access lists were revised, and long-standing plans were wiped from official schedules. Camilla then received formal notice that all matters regarding William's future court were being removed from her department's jurisdiction immediately. The future household encompassed the staff, advisors, and organizational structure that would serve the new king. Deprived of oversight in these areas, her office lost its ability to shape the upcoming reign. She dismissed her secretary, closed the door, and dropped her usual composure. She had anticipated friction over the transition, but had not expected the king to completely strip her office of authority over the matter. Charles directed a comprehensive audit of all transition-related files, contacts, and proposed assignments. No department could promise positions or represent William's interests without explicit written authorization. This policy was enacted to prevent verbal promises from becoming binding once the crown passed during a chaotic transition period. Meanwhile, and took temporary charge of the confidential briefing papers used to prepare the heir for his duties, with the clear objective of separating official planning from personal interest. William took no satisfaction in these developments. While he desired protection from internal manipulation, the decree was fracturing family relationships while his father was still alive. Stripping Camilla's office of authority carried heavy personal consequences, and William knew the sudden cancellations would be viewed as an aggressive move on his part. Catherine then uncovered a further breach within their own team. A staff member admitted in a written statement to being approached for details regarding William's preferred choices for key positions. Though presented as routine preparation, it proved that the internal campaign had breached their immediate household. Catherine felt initial anger followed by deep worry, realizing their private discussions had been monitored well before the decree was signed. During a subsequent briefing, Charles' unsteady stance forced and to step in and support him before aides noticed. Though the king brushed off the incident, his sister recognized that the decree had been executed with an urgency William did not fully grasp. That evening, the prince requested another private discussion with his father, this time with no state papers, no officials, and no formal protocol between them. The surrounding drama had exposed hidden motives throughout the palace, but the path forward depended on whether two estranged leaders could speak plainly as father and son. Sitting across from each other in a small private sitting room usually reserved for family matters, Charles and William met without red dispatch boxes or waiting secretaries. For the first time, William did not demand that the decree be revoked. Instead, he asked directly whether his father was protecting the crown from him or protecting him from what would happen once the king was gone. Charles looked down, the long silence answering the question before he spoke. William had intentionally stripped away all institutional barriers, recognizing that their previous clash had been derailed by legalities and pride. This time, he sought an honest answer from his father rather than an official line from the monarch. Charles admitted his core concern. The initial year of a new reign brings overwhelming grief, public scrutiny, internal pressure, and absolute authority all at once. No amount of preparation can fully brace an heir for waking up as a mourning son burdened with decisions that shape the future of the nation. The king envisioned eager advisors pressing his son for immediate commitments before he had time to process his loss. Charles confessed that this scenario drove his decision. He was not trying to restrain an unfit heir, but attempting to shield an exhausted son from making permanent mistakes during his most vulnerable moment. His voice strained as he acknowledged that the safety net was built for a time when he would no longer be present to offer guidance. William listened quietly before sharing his own hurt. He had viewed the restrictions as proof that his father deemed him incapable of holding real authority. Yet his deepest fear was far more personal: inheriting the throne without ever knowing if his father had confidence in his ability to rule. Charles then presented a sealed amendment, an official edition allowing the Regency Council to dissolve after 6 months if members unanimously agreed the new king was operating with complete stability. The monarch was not abandoning caution, but offering his son a clear framework to establish his independence early. William reviewed the page and signed it, accepting the temporary oversight not as a humiliation, but as a protective measure rooted in a father's concern. Though father and son achieved a private resolution, the public narrative was about to explode. At 6 o'clock the following morning, news outlets broke the story, featuring images of Charles signing the document alongside headlines detailing limits placed on the heir's first year. Media coverage was continuous, with commentators labeling the move unprecedented. A large crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace, split between those praising the king's foresight and those arguing William had been publicly disgraced. The narrative shifted dramatically following a live broadcast watched by William and Catherine, in which a presenter framed the decree as a father's ultimate vote of no confidence. Although the palace issued an official statement framing the 12-month arrangement as a mutually agreed transition safeguard, the formal explanation could not contain the rising media storm. Catherine watched her husband closely, aware that the discussion had moved past legal frameworks into questions of personal trust. While some experts commended the move as constitutional prudence designed to prevent hasty choices, others declared the relationship between the king and his heir damaged beyond repair. William absorbed the commentary, particularly the damaging claim that his father considered him unready to lead. Charles followed the news from his study, asking if William had seen the reports. The king ignored the personal criticism leveled against him, but reacted strongly to doubts raised about his son's readiness, and set the signed amendment on his desk as a quiet reminder of the private agreement the public knew nothing about. William stood up and headed for the exit before Catherine could stop him, rejecting a prepared media statement and brushing aside advice to wait for security to manage the crowd outside. Moments later, the gates opened, and the prince walked directly toward the gathered public as reporters shouted questions over the noise of the crowd. The area fell quiet as William raised his hand to speak. Avoiding personal defense or criticism of the council, he reframed the situation entirely, stating that his father had not weakened his future, but had helped him carry the weight of it. Charles watched the broadcast live, closing his eyes in visible relief as the tension left his face, and remained silent, resting her hand near the amendment and recognizing that the future monarch had protected both his father and the crown with a single unscripted remark. The public had anticipated a major royal rift, but instead witnessed an heir embracing responsibility while a father demonstrated trust in his son's leadership. Ultimately, the emergency decree did not hinder William's path to the throne or reduce the authority he will eventually hold. It forced the future king to confront the true demands of his role, while forcing Charles to acknowledge that his most severe actions stemmed from fear, care, and the realization that his time to guide his son was finite. What started as an aggressive restriction transformed into a final lesson passed from one monarch to the next. Charles maintained the decree's legal status, though its terms were significantly modified. The 6-month review amendment ensured the oversight period could conclude early provided the council verified William's readiness, turning the restriction into a clear measure of capability rather than an ongoing mechanism of control, and assumed leadership of the council, assuring both men that the body would focus solely on institutional stability rather than personal influence. She recognized that while the monarchy could endure internal disagreements, it could not withstand covert struggles for power behind the scenes. Her mandate was to safeguard the transition and ensure no outside group could influence the upcoming reign in secret. Charles then presented the signing pen to William. An object that initially symbolized mistrust was transformed into an acknowledgement that the prince understood his father's motives without compromising his own standing. Though the king offered no verbal apology for taking steps to protect the crown, his expression communicated his intent clearly. William took the pen and later placed it next to a photograph of his father rather than locking it away. He no longer viewed the order as a sign of doubt, but as a difficult act of parental foresight from a father aware that he would not be present to guide his son through the early days of his reign. Camilla's office lost all management over transition plans. Catherine's advisory role was formally established, and all prospective household appointments were subjected to transparent review. These measures effectively ended internal attempts to influence the next administration, guaranteeing that William will select his own team when he ascends the throne. Charles and William subsequently appeared together at an official event, walking side by side in a relaxed, natural manner that required no public explanation. The rift concluded not with one side prevailing over the other, but with both accepting their respective duties. The signature that initially appeared to divide the monarch and his heir ultimately sealed their shared understanding. The crown moves forward not through rigid compliance, but through earned trust, accepted duty, and genuine mutual respect. Thank you for tuning in. Please remember to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next